Greetings, comrades, and welcome back to the Eastern Border. This time I am literally freezing here because it got super cold for some reason. But our guest for today, I hope you don't have such problems, Mike. You have been lost for a long while, so one, I hope that you're safe and back home, and two, I hope that you're warm because, well, you do have to visit me at some point because I'm not sure you've experienced minus 12 degrees and having to heat up your house. Or did you when you were like traveling around the planet?
I'm back in Australia now, so it's actually quite ridiculously warm at the moment. But yeah, experienced a lot of those cold temperatures. I spent some time up in the Arctic, spent a lot of time in Russia over the years, and I think the worst one I flew into Uzbekistan a few years ago. It was during that massive cold snap that came out of nowhere. It was like negative 22. With no power, no water, and no gas, and it was awful because I remember getting off my long flight from Australia, walking into the shower and seeing that there was just a slick of ice on the bottom of the shower and no hot water, and yeah, that was a tough choice to make, and I picked not being smelly over actually feeling my heart not palpitating at a million miles a minute.
You'll be surprised because my aunt has long, like, childhood friends living there, and they were visiting us in Riga while the cold snap happened, and everyone was just freaking out. They called their neighbors to like turn off the water and everything. It was pretty great.
Yeah, it was. They were burning garbage in the streets. It was a pretty crazy time.
Also, don't flex your lot of time spent in Russia. Ugh. Over here, Comer. No, no. Well, what you missed since last time you were here? I now live 22 kilometers from the Russian border. I started a PhD in political science about, Russia's theocratical ideology and everything. And glad to see you here, Mike. For one, little short thing, because I know a bunch of my listeners also listen to you.
Mm.
What did you actually do when you were taking a break, or what? Or have you also been infected by academia?
No, again, it kind of came all at once. The show obviously for 2025, sorry, God, at the end of the year. It's the start of the year, so I was getting the date wrong. It became harder and harder, and usually what we'd be able to do is kind of edit episodes a bit generously and kind of take our time with things. But with how the pace of change was going in the world, it was just becoming more and more difficult to do episodes of the show. And then I had my second child coming. We had an episode that just became incredibly difficult. And then on top of that, I'd been, we're doing the show for effectively 6 years. And I don't think I hadn't had a day off in about a year because I usually work 7 days a week. And it just I was burning out to a point where I was just no longer enjoying it at all and had so much other work on my plate and something had to give. And it was, a bit of doomerism as well of kind of, wow, the world is pretty crazy at the moment. But yeah, having just a little bit of time to kind of get your head back on and take a bit of a breath from the constant daily chaos.
Well, sadly or luckily, I understand exactly how you feel. I had a similar story here. This is why if you look at my feed, because you see a very crazy episode which is 5 hours long with Ozzy Osbourne in it, because that was my very gonzo, very weird. My dad dedicated episode, which is surreal, and after that we restarted. So that's how I got everything together. But welcome back to the business. I'm sorry that we're like you might want to leave Central Asia behind, but Central Asia won't leave you behind.
No, I'm always happy to talk about Central Asia. My wife's sick of hearing about it, and so we'll talk to anyone who wants to hear me talk about Central Asia.
Well, yeah, there are some interesting things because, for one, I really wanted to get you on because you'll be surprised for how long this has been going. Lately, and well, we'll go in order here. And Tevran here, yeah, actually sent him quite detailed questions there. We have issues with Kazakhstan, and not just in the sense that Tokayev is again moving around or doing something shady. It's the fact that Russian military volunteers who provide aid to the Russian army, they basically fund FPV drones and other dual-use stuff with their own cash. And already since it's January now, since about September, they have been like piling up on the border. And I've seen many theories here because the Z crowd themselves, well, by now it's like over 1,000 trucks. And some Z authors claim that at least part of them are locked up by the Russians who expect bribes. Part of the Chinese just send them over and don't care. And then people have theories about what's going on the Kazakhstan side. Because I know that those cars are there. People went there and photoed, but the line is so long and bureaucracy is so horrid and that no one knows what's actually happening and how could this even be moving. And you, as our Central Asia expert, please explain what's going on with the trucks and the movement, because I know that everyone's complaining about them, but nobody knows anything.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of different issues kind of all culminating at once. You got kind of the Kazakhs are desperate to try and not get secondary sanctions. Obviously, there's people who don't want the war effort or more military equipment going from Kazakhstan into Russia. And if they get caught, that's a problem. So you end up having this, some parts get through, some parts don't, and it's who gets priorities. Yes, there is bribe problems there as well. But a lot of this is also just due to poor infrastructure as well. The Russians, particularly since Operation Spiderweb, have been much more cautious on what they vet and what they let into the country, because obviously they had a bit of problems with that operation coming back into Russia. But at the same time, Kazakhstan, their trade on that border has actually gone up as well. And this is kind of a problem where, because the Russian ruble has become so weak in recent times, a lot of the kind of consumer goods that might have been comparatively cheap to buy from China or somewhere else have become really cheap to get through Russia. So you end up having the problem of more goods are being exported. They're buying lots of stuff from Russia as well. And then on top of that, Kazakhstan's exports just for 2024 to 25 toward the European Union are up like 75%, exporting to the European, but up 75%. And imports from the European is up like 93%. So there's the same border infrastructure with more security stuff, with Russia more cautious, with way more traffic going through it. And it's just a recipe for, some of it is politically driven. Other times it's just they're not ready for effectively the amount of trade going across that border.
My economist sources say that trade between Russia and China has also gone down by 15%. That's because Russian people are just getting poorer at the moment. So it's all a bit messy over there too.
It's an interesting one with trade between Russia and China, because unlike, there is a lot of consumer goods crossing that border, but a lot of consumer goods coming out of China go through a third party. Goods will come through Kazakhstan, and that might register as Kazakh trade, which gets a bit weird. But at the same time, Russians are becoming a bit poorer, which obviously means less consumer stuff is being bought in from China. Much of the Chinese trade between them is in raw minerals and materials, and effectively China is buying from a lot more sources. So, if they're buying coal or gas from Turkmenistan or, whatever they want to buy, that will obviously lower the demand for Russia, and that will show up pretty solidly on that trade deficit. So, yeah, some of it is because the Russians are getting poorer. Some of it's because a lot of the commodities they buy from Russia are also getting cheaper on other markets. So it's a whole bunch of factors.
So it's general mess, everything business as usual, basically.
Oh, it's Russia. It's always a mess.
Another thing that I've noticed, especially about Kazakhstan, is that normally you would see some threats thrown there, here and there, especially on the more far right side, Russkaya Narodnaya Druzhina, all those people. But lately on the Vatnik sphere, they've been posting videos from Kazakh people talking about how they actually support Ukraine and how Putin's a dictator. And then they also, in response, post some other Kazakh people stating that, very pro-Russian Kazakh people who are speaking in Russian and saying that they're Kazakhs, but they like Russia. Is there some sort of internal thing going on in Kazakhstan right now? Before I saw some things commented about that, the usual threat from Solovyov about how Baikonur is the rightful Russian clay, all that nonsense. But lately, especially on their social media, they are now reposting Kazakh posts of political opinions about Ukraine war and everything. And at least from my perspective, it seems to me that the question is being more intensified at this moment in Kazakhstan. What's going on there? Why could this be important to them? Or am I just mistaken, and it's just the Z crowd just discovered a trend that existed for a long time already?
No, it's a trend that's been building up a lot more in recent times. There has been more politicians making this claim. I don't think Astana takes it incredibly seriously, because Kazakhstan is kind of one of the only countries you can kind of push back a little bit on, and the Kazakhs won't give too much of a problem. But the other thing is that there's also massive differences between different parts of the country. If you, let's say, hang out in the bars and you talk to younger people in Almaty, then yeah, they're much more anti-Russia than they have been in previous times. I mean, the country was like a 70-something% approval of Russia going before 2022. But then you go up to, let's say, up toward the North Kazakhstan state, so Petropavl or up to Pavlodar, and then you end up having like 50% of the population, or I think it's like 52 or something of that variety of the population in Petropavl being Russian. And they have a lot of affinity for Russia. They're much more pro the war. So it also depends on what kind of parts of the country you're looking at. I mean, there have been increased kind of separatist pushes or increased rhetoric going on in those areas. But it's also like a minimum amount of people doing so. And again, this is probably something that's going to start to change, particularly right now, as Kazakhs per capita earn more than Russians per capita at the moment. So if, as like we see with Estonia, the richer the Kazakhs get, the less sort of sympathetic they'll be to Russia. But again, if you're Kazakhstan right now, you have to walk that tightrope between, Russia is where all your exports go through. It's where it's the lifeline and it helps you get your commodities out to the European market. But at the same time, you don't want to just be, a vassal state of the Kremlin either.
Well, there's another business that is actually booming right now from Kazakhstan, because if I watch Russian liberal opposition like Maxim Katz and Michael Naki and Khodorkovsky even, a lot of ads that they read in between their shows is from newly just plopped up Kazakh banks whose only job is they basically offer you a bank card to which you can transfer money from your Russian account and then you pay in Europe. That's a huge product there.
That is a massive product. It's been much bigger in previous years in Kyrgyzstan, because Kyrgyzstan has the benefit of being within the Eurasian Economic Union, and Kyrgyzstan's been pretty good on its banking laws in the past. And when you go to Kyrgyzstan, they're everywhere. You can use these kind of Russian accounts for most things, and it allows you to, actually a massive part of the Kyrgyz financial economy is Russian rubles that are transferred into Kyrgyz som, which get transferred into US dollars. It's a massive, massive trade there.
I just noticed this because these ads for Kazakh bank accounts are right now as popular on the Russian liberal opposition YouTube scene as Raycons or Audible or something. It's just crazy.
The reason is that effectively, a few years ago, Kyrgyzstan's always been the kind of most, for lack of a better word, open, democratic of the 5 Central Asian states. But then Japarov, the strongman who's in power at the moment, effectively seized one of the country's major gold mine from the Canadians. And there's been real concern at that point that, okay, well, Japarov can seize that. Can he start seizing banks? And everyone, particularly if they've got lots of money, is a bit more nervous to put all their money inside Kyrgyzstan and maybe have it seized, or have, let's say, the Kyrgyz government stop propping up the Kyrgyz som to keep its value against the dollar, and you end up losing a bunch of money. Whereas Kazakhstan is relatively reasonable when it comes to banking and finance. So, for instance, if you do a mining contract in Kazakhstan, the Kazakhs will allow you to arbitrate decisions around those contracts in the British High Court. Which makes a lot of financial guys feel a lot more comfortable knowing that the Kazakhs are less likely to just steal the money and run away with it. So yeah, it's a sign of this is a product that's existed in Kyrgyzstan for a long time. It still does in huge amounts, but I think some of the investors are getting a little more nervous about Kyrgyzstan and are looking at a safe haven, and Kazakhstan is that option.
If we're switching to Kyrgyzstan, well, that'll be a nice segue to the next one. Kyrgyzstan had a lot of border conflicts around with Tajikistan, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
They were constantly bickering with them, which I found a bit weird. But then I actually read on their history and understood that they kind of didn't have a state before the USSR happened, actually. How's that going? Have they finally settled to some sort of actual peace, or is it like a ceasefire situation?
Yeah, it's a complicated situation, effectively.
Because honestly, I haven't had any time at all in my life to follow Central Asia. So,
if people did their own research on Central Asia, I'd never get hired for anything. Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan have had this weird relationship for a long time, where Kyrgyzstan's obviously been a little bit wary of Tajikistan because the Tajiks are a bit different from the rest of Central Asia. They're more kind of Persian, Iranian than the other 4, which tend to be a little more Turkic. But also there's been terrorism problems and civil wars in throughout Tajikistan for a while, back in the day anyway. The conflict kind of built up and up over 2021, and then into 2022, you had this massive conflict, or for the region, massive conflict in Batken. Now, Batken's an area where the borders are really poorly demarcated. Farmers always kind of go across the border, and you end up having border guards firing at each other. And this has ended up spilling into this big conflict that really embarrassed Kyrgyzstan, because they did fairly badly in that one, but also just revealed a whole bunch of weaknesses in the Tajik military as well. Both sides kind of, at that point, had an incentive to try and solve this issue and stop this happening, because both sides end up just nearly over doubling military spending and spending a bunch to kind of rearm themselves and get ready for something. What we've ended up now is that both sides have demarcated the border, or at least drawn a line of, hey, here's where the border is. But at the same time, both sides are heavily rearming both sides of the border. Kyrgyzstan, for instance, is pushing a lot of troops into the south. Tajikistan's bolstering its forces in the north, where the borders meet in this area. So I think the best analogy I've ever heard of this is, previously there was kind of 2 men walking around with a barrel of open gasoline and a lighter. Now they put the lids on the gasoline, but there's 6 or 7 barrels on each side. So if it does kick off again, it'll be much, much bigger, but it has been somewhat cooled by the border actually being officially demarcated now. Fencing being put up on the Kyrgyz side, so there's less chance of what used to happen, which is kind of a farmer would walk, their flock into the other country to kind of drink water, eat grass. The local border guards would come and tell the farmer to go away, and then the other side's border guards would come defend the farmer or tell the other side to go away, and that's where the tensions came from. With a fence, yeah, that does solve some of the problems, but both sides are still rearming. So it's better than it was, and it's less likely to go to war, but if it does, it'll be much heavier than what we saw in 2022.
I actually have a funny reference about that, but keep that in mind. But talking about burning things, you made me remember my very favorite what was this ultimate neutral country with the best Turkmenbashi leader, praise be upon him, and his horse, or whichever this one is. I've the only thing I've heard from them all this year was the fact that their big gateway to hell is actually finally not burning anymore. But as that's as little as we hear from over there.
There's lots going on in Turkmenistan at the moment. There's kind of this weird situation where the country, I think, the country is in very dire, poor situation economically. It's become so reliant on effectively just the gas and oil industry and China as its primary client, that it knows that, the economy is only going to get worse, and more of the infrastructure is degrading. The chance of rebellion is only going up. So they're trying to figure out where they go from here. The country is kind of really hesitant to get too close with Russia, even though the military and security services tend to be. And I think this really showed how bad the relationships got quite recently, when the head of the Turkmen rail service took an S7 flight, which is funny that he flies S7, but still, from Ashgabat into Moscow with his mistress, and his mistress mouthed off to the border guards. They checked her luggage, and inside the luggage there was a bunch of LSD. Now, usually when the two states are in good conditions, Ramadov would end up calling Lavrov, and this would all kind of get also Merdov, not Ramadov. The two would call each other, they'd back and forth, and then everything would be kind of sorted under the table. But not only did the Russians push forward with the prosecution, but they allowed the Turkmen guy to effectively testify that, hey, I'd rather be in prison in Russia than go back to Turkmenistan, which is a massive kind of, because we don't get a lot of indicators from inside palace politics, but it is an indicator that Russia is in a bit of an odd state when it comes to Turkmenistan. And Turkmenistan has kind of spent this year reaching out to more countries and starting to do things like offer to chair the next meeting of the CIS, which is really unprecedented for those guys, start to reach out to the OSCE, start to reach out and try and be a little less isolationist, because I think they know that the current trajectory is not going to be good for them going forward.
I guess that explains also why they have this, again, named after the great leader's horse. They have a team which unsurprisingly hasn't won a single game in their own domestic league, created literally in that, I think, 2024, but is actually playing in the Asian Champions League football games too, which they didn't do. I think they didn't participate much in like sports activities, even regional ones, that much. I was surprised about this, but come to think of it, yeah, they do seem to be opening up a bit. But I bet you still, well, I have to find out when I won't need a written invitation to go and visit them, because actually I would like to see some weird statues and such.
I mean, it's still a very, very close country. I mean, on the Freedom House Freedom scale, they are lower than North Korea. Like, it is a very, very closed, repressive state still. Don't get me wrong. And they have done a lot of interesting actions. Like, it's much harder for, let's say, fighting age men to go and study overseas now. They changed the rules a little while ago that you can't renew your passport from an overseas institution, which effectively means that if you're a dissident, you have to go back to Turkmenistan to renew your passport or end up stateless, which is quite terrifying for some of them. But yeah, it's an interesting time going forward, particularly after the kind of botched power transition we saw a few years ago.
Botched power transition there? Okay, please remind me that one. I thought that the Gurbanguly Berdi Muhamedov, first try, kind of went away, and then his son stepped into power, as far as I remember, right?
Yeah, so effectively the senior, so we'll call him Berdi Senior, but his full name is Gurbanguly Berdi Muhamedov.
Congratulations.
Yeah, I said that name a few times. He was effectively getting ready to hand over to his son, and did a lot of work to get him ready for that. His son would be the foreign minister, the mayor of Ashgabat. He'd done some time with the armed services. They groomed his son, who looks up like a pretty awkward guy at times, ready for this. And he got into power, and his father stepped back, particularly as there was rumors that his father was in ill health. But then what it seemed is he really couldn't keep things under control. And there's effectively, behind the scenes in Turkmenistan, there's a bunch of what they call the aunties, which are effectively quite senior. It's a few women who are quite senior, kind of behind the scenes, who are massive power brokers in the country. The aunties apparently weren't confident with Sadar's leadership, and then demanded that Bertie Senior, effectively the father, come back, and he runs effectively a chamber of parliament, for lack of a better word. I'm just going to keep it really simple for this one, that has a bunch of powers, particularly to do with the oil and gas industry and a few other bits and pieces. And that was a massive sign that that people in the country were not confident that Sadar could run the country by himself, and that there had to be his father still pulling a lot of the legislative levers and doing a lot of the deals behind the scenes, which again, it stabilized things. But now everyone's thinking, well, what happens when Bertie Senior has to leave? Will Sadar be enough to hold power at that point? Because obviously he had his trial and it wasn't successful. So I think everyone's watching that quite closely.
Look, at this point in reality, I would just say if a random war, civil or otherwise, doesn't pop out, then it's a win.
Yeah.
Our standards so far my geopolitical standards have fallen this low at this point. Really, it is just pretty horrid. But now the main thing why I really wanted to ask you, because I thought the Kazakhstan situation would be more interesting, because I have read like 19,000 different conspiracy theories about evil Kazakh plans and how they want to infiltrate everyone. But the big issue here is that right now, a surprising country has moved up, besides Ukraine and the Baltics, because we are on a different scale for Russian Z people, right? But besides that, number one country that they hate after the default ones is Azerbaijan, because I do have to give credit where credit is due. Azerbaijan, I forgot his name. Azerbaijani leader really. He did very petty things, but they really worked for Putin, and he just managed he went all out, especially when putting the Turkish base 11 kilometers from the border with Russia. Yeah. But now, second country is Tajikistan. And you would think that it was because of the Crocus attacks. But no, because again, at that point, Tajiks didn't get the hate, and no one really blamed ISIS over there, because the first reaction of Russian propaganda back then was to blame Ukraine. How they solved this was also, I pretty much... This comes from my sources, which I don't like to use, but again, basically 4 random Russian cops just picked up some random Tajiks on the street, beat them up, and just made a check mark. Cool, guilty party found, and that was that. And then apparently Tajikistan, at least people there, kind of felt bad about this. This comes from Tajik diaspora over there, because that's the default view, at least in St. Petersburg, where I have relatives. And the thing is that Tajiks also recently are under attack constantly by these Russian people's militias, Ruskaya Narodnaya Druzhina. These are people who kind of stemmed out from Igor Girkin's supporter group, and they form around their own ideology about Orthodox Stalinism. That's what I'm working on my PhD. It's long and complicated, but I've made an episode on how Russia is better understood as a religious experience also. It's kind of like... It has like two beings of existence. And then these guys decided that Tajiks get blamed for all the crime in Russia done by migrants all the time. And it was 2 weeks ago or something, these Russian militia guys, why they actually matter and why I read these Vatniks, they, I think in Krasnodar, they actually went to a school, because this Tajik guy got into a fight with a Russian guy about a girl. Like, they're both like 16, 17 teenagers getting into a bit of a kerfuffle. Like, honestly, nothing serious. However, as they're ultra mega far right, to the point that it's insane, they imagine a group of armed militias dressed up all like in black, with wearing face masks and everything. So they literally stormed in a classroom and pulled him out, threatened him with guns, and then they had a very, very polite conversation with the Tajik guy about how he's obviously been the instigator of this whole fight. And of course, we had like a very nice, very filmed, apology video. Those are totally fake, and those are totally real and never have been faked ever. There is no one standing behind. Yeah, well, you understand what I mean. That's the whole situation. And currently I see a lot about Tajik organized crime and everything. And recently they've caught on to the fact that, if I recall correctly, I think it was one of your fellow Australians, maybe Wendover, or maybe half as interesting. So one of those. He made a video about how in Tajikistan there's a bunch of ISIS Khorasan groups going on there. It's mega Tajik focused, but it started before this. But now, because of all these activities, it's been very painful. And knowing that, how basically Russia has a much worse workforce problem than everywhere else at the moment, for weird reasons. Like, agricultural sector lacks 40% of its workers at the time. And yeah, the situation is that this kind of dooms them because of their ideology. These Vatniks who are actively supporting the Russian army, well, yeah, they They keep dying on the front lines. Basically, 99% Tajiks are brought in right now, and they obviously don't like this. But then it sort of exploded with the fact that this Tajik kid was just taken from the school. And at that point, I think even Abtial Odunov said something about this, which was a bit crazy. But then again, he's a more public figure. Then we had very recently this Russia's school stabbing with the guy basically quoting Deshergar Rusic and this Russian national militia people who also wanted to stab the evil Tajiks. It's ethnic tensions are rising, but I understand like they've had them with Chechens a lot. They've had them with a bunch of peoples. I just checked up, like did a cursory research. It's not my specialty, but I really wanted to know why exactly. And I don't seem to understand why Tajiks are singled out and why it's just is like the situation with the Khorasan ice is so bad in Tajikistan, why it's specifically that country that apparently is the main source of work migrants to Russia at the moment.
This is a hugely complex and diverse issue, but let's go through kind of some of the drivers. On the Tajik side, the Tajik government is so reliant on the Russians for pretty much everything that the Tajik government has to kind of take this beating from Moscow and can't really say that much back. If you look at 2024, for instance, Tajik economy was like 47 or around that area % funded by Russian remittances, like Tajik workers going to Russia and sending money back. So that means that effectively Putin could wake up, change the rules around visas, and Tajikistan's economy halves overnight. That is terrifying position if Dushanbe to be in. You've also seen the largest Russian base outside of Russia or Ukraine is in Tajikistan, the 201st military base. So they have a fairly significant military presence there in the region as well. So Tajikistan kind of has to be nice to Russia. And it's interesting that when Russia the Crocus Hall attacks happened, which they blamed on Tajiks, in those first opening hours, we saw the actual Tajik MBD or the Ministry of Internal Affairs effectively come out and say, no, it's not, one of the guys you blamed isn't, a culprit. We know where he is. He was somewhere in the middle of Russia at the time. And then they had to effectively walk back that message because the Russians put, pressure on them to walk it back. It's one of the first times I've seen the Tajiks really push back on the Russians. So the Tajiks effectively are also a little bit different, as we went through before, from the rest of the Central Asians. As while the other four are kind of Turkic, the Tajiks are always seen as kind of the odd one out, and they're talked down to a bit. Yeah, like it's interesting. Even when I go to bars in Dushanbe, and if I'm having a drink with Russians, they'll be friendly with the Tajiks. But a lot of the time, when the Tajiks leave, and it's just the Russians and myself at the bar, they'll talk crap about the Tajiks immediately. It's a really odd thing to see. Even in Moscow, you get the don't go to this area, it's full of Tajiks, which is, it's kind of the punching bag.
I guess that's a bit less friendlier version than what we have here in Latvia, Lithuania, and Finland about Estonians. We love Estonians. It's just a joke. It's a joke because I need to make some comedy here because we switched from hello there, haven't seen you for a while. Let's talk about acts of terrorism and an awful thing.
Yeah. It's. Yeah,
but I want to answer. Joe asked, but why? I can tell you that 99% is linguistical because Estonians to us sound a bit weird, and the Finns, well, Estonians try to tell Finnish people that they're Nordic, but they're like, nope, go back to Baltics. That's here. It's the cultural differences that accumulate over time. You're nearby. You're sort of similar, but you're different. Long study.
Hey everyone, Annette here. Thanks for listening to another episode of The Eastern Border. This show is possible thanks to your support. So if you like what you hear, head over to patreon.com/The Eastern Border and help us keep it going. Even small contributions make a difference. And don't forget, there's also a Discord. If you want to join the community, chat with Kristaps, share memes, or just learn more about history, come hang out. You'll find the link in the show notes. Thanks again. And now, back to the episode.
Yeah, I guess for the Tajiks, there's also this weird dynamic happening at the moment where Putin is doing what a lot of countries do, where when their economy is not doing well and they need someone to blame, they pick, ethnic minorities and blame all the country's woes on them. And Tajiks have been the punching bag for a long time when it comes to that, and this happens all over the place. even though that Tajiks probably only make up, a small percentage of overall corruption or crime, it's easier to pick on those guys because it gives everyone an us versus them mentality. And while there's a lot more crossover and kind of intermarriage between, let's say, Kazakhs and Russians, there's not as much between Tajiks and Russians. It's not as common. It's the same way that, like the recent corruption or the corruption scandal in Minnesota, it's like everyone's focusing on the Somali community, which is, again, it was bad corruption, but it's only a small percentage of the overall corruption problem. But it's easier to focus on that and demonize one group. So the Russians, with Putin having effectively a poor economy, having to blame someone for security faults because drones keep getting through or the Crocus Hall attacks happen, it's a lot easier to keep demonizing these Tajiks above all else. The other reason that we tend to find that Tajikistan kind of gets lumped in with ISK is a couple of drivers, but one of the ones is simply because the Tajiks have less control over their border than the other states. If you look at, let's say, you're Afghanistan, you're trying to get into Central Asia, getting into Turkmenistan is pretty difficult. And if you cross the border into, Sahatabad or Tagdabazar, it's a long desert to get to any decent cities. So you don't see a lot of people trying that route. Uzbekistan, the border between them and Afghanistan is effectively a quite short, a river border with like one crossing over a bridge, and it's very well defended. It's quite hard to smuggle into Uzbekistan without just bribing guards. The Tajik border is massive, long, and easy to sneak across, and it's why that tends to be, because it's the path of least resistance, the way that ISK fighters tend to get in. But there's also another factor in here that people tend to not realize is that everyone in Tajikistan, particularly in the border service, is incentivized to lie about it as well. Right now there's a situation where every time that there's an ISK attack or there's a separatist attack, the government throws more money at the border service, the Chinese throw more money at the border service, and the Russians will throw money at the border service. There was an attack, about a year ago or 2 years ago now, where Tajikistan made a big deal about it, saying that Afghans were on the other side of the border. They were firing at the Tajiks. And then when I actually started calling around to businesses who were based in that area and asking, I'll pay you a couple of US dollars to tell me the real story, it turned out it was one farmer who'd drunkenly be taking pot shots, across the river at goats. But everyone, because they have that incentive to build in, this is a more serious issue, it does tend to get a little over-exaggerated. That said, the last couple of weeks has been escalating attacks on the Tajik-Afghan border, with 5 Chinese workers dying the other day, 3 Afghans coming across the border with a bunch of heavy weapons and getting in a full fight with the Tajik border service. So it's a growing issue, but I think there's kind of a lot more angles to it than I think most people realize.
Yeah, but why exactly Tajikistan out of all places? Is it really because of the borders? What's the political situation there? You said Kyrgyzstan was taken over by this strongman leader. People are worried about the banks there. What's happening there politically?
In Kyrgyzstan or Tajikistan? Because Tajikistan's effectively got the same strongman who's been in since 1994, Imamali Rahman, who has the most amazing eyebrows I've ever seen in my life. So the situation...
I will never pronounce that name. I will call him Lukashenko too.
I think he's just... Yeah, Lukashenko's 93, so Lukashenko beats him just. But the country it's been a lot easier to get stuff across the border into Tajikistan. And there's kind of a problem that's been happening in recent times where everyone knew that's where heroin and drugs and stuff were coming across the border into the country. So the government, particularly with the Chinese, made a kind of arrangement of, look, we know that if we crack down on all the heroin crossings, then effectively everyone's going to just go into the mountains, we'll never find them, and terrorists can get that way. So we're going to try and have a system where the Afghans bring it to the border, drop it, and the Tajik border forces take it the rest of the way. And that's been the system for quite a while now. So there's kind of it is the smuggling hub. It is the one where you can get corruption into the country. It is the one where, out of the 3, you're most likely to see pockets of areas where the government really has no control of the area. Turkmenistan's too secure, and Uzbekistan, has the money to properly patrol their border with Afghanistan. Tajikistan effectively relies on donations from the Chinese and the Russians to do so.
I mean, well, it kind of makes sense because, allegedly, the guy that runs like the border crossing points here in our border next door to us, he allegedly used to be a smuggler and basically stole 25 railway cars of cigarettes from the Soviet army as they were leaving. Allegedly, never happened. Maybe here.
It's quite a common practice in Tajikistan that you will have a street of people, of families, who will effectively pull their money together to bribe one of their kids into the border service to serve on the southern border, because you can make that much more money, effectively being the guy who takes the bribe to let stuff get across. That's quite a common practice in parts of Tajikistan. So again, there is ISK getting in, it's a little over exaggerated. ISK is still much more kind of inside Afghanistan and actually usually either pushed down toward the Pashtun areas and near the border with Pakistan, or they're way out toward the west, closer to Herat. But it is an issue that's coming further and further up. Is it a massive threat to the Tajik government? Probably not at this point, but it's definitely a concern point that if left unchecked, you're not going to see 200 ISIS-K guys kind of come across the border and try and seize a town, but the lone wolf attacks are definitely a concern for the government.
Well, I find this very interesting. Again, I can contrast this with here, where due to our very low population density in this area, my little town and my little region, Ludza district, with like 16,000 people living in it, yeah, we have a disproportionately huge hospital and all sorts of amenities and a bunch of infrastructure thing, because over here the government actually has to throw money and provide like higher pay and a better standard of living because it's so far from Riga. Over here, no one wants to become a border guard. Yeah, it's different. You don't have to bribe anyone. The government's literally, if you want to become a border guard, free tuition, and then they just built a Sinsay megastore here. A border guard's wife is weird. Kind of, it's so polarly opposite from what I see. It's just crazy.
I mean, we're only safe in Australia because the New Zealanders haven't learned to swim yet, so we're pretty safe for now.
Come on, dude. They're New Zealanders. At least Tajiks and the rest of Central Asians are related between each other. Everyone knows New Zealand is just straight up Wales, basically.
Oh, if it exists, I've seen a lot of maps where it's not there, so I'll choose to believe whether it's there or not.
I mean, I would really love to see it one day if it exists, obviously. But then, because Tajikistan and all this ISIS stuff is a bit depressing. But let's talk about even more depressing stuff.
That's what I do, baby. I finish so many of my briefings I give over the years with, "Oh, sorry to depress everyone."
Happiness is mandatory.
So used to this, yeah.
No, but basically, there's an even more little sad state which is going to probably cease to exist pretty soon. Let's talk about Transnistria now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
At this moment, basically everyone on the Z space thinks that it's just a matter of being they just get annexed.
Mm-hmm.
They finally get gas now over there. I don't know how they're, because I think they had like a new prime minister for a while, but the situation there is pretty dire. Because one of the YouTube channels that I watch who makes videos about the Balkans, called Living Ironically in Europe, really great guy.
I love that channel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he made a video recently about he just visited Transnistria, and it was very weird. I have been like arrested there, but Russia hasn't really done anything there because they can't, and the locals were just cut off from the rest of the world basically for a while. And now, how does it look like? There were some talks about some cooperation there. I know they get their gas from Moldova now, but everyone seems to believe that every time Moldova decides to do anything pro-European, it's 100% confirmed Romania is going to invade us with their secret services. Yeah, my dear Romanian listeners, basically you are the top secret service in the Balkans, apparently, at least according to Russians, and they are just super worried, mostly about the shells, slightly less about the people. But for example, that's Igor Girkin's best buddies, Maxim Kalashnikov's great pain that to these people, the Vatniks, they will consider this Russia-Ukraine war a victory until they can have a land bridge to Transnistria. But then you hear nothing out from Transnistria. I was really absorbing this Living Ironically in Europe guy, but he just showed us the historical parts, but, well, not much about the current events. I know Sheriff's still in power. They're not going to go anywhere. But what's happening there? Because again, everyone is on the Russian Z space talks about them a lot, but there are no messages from them. It's just speculation. So maybe you know, because Transnistria is also one of your best specialties.
Specialty is a bit generous, but it's an interesting situation for the country. Well, for a number of reasons. One, that there is more Russia influence still there than I think a lot of people think there is. There's always these stories of Moldova. Oh, we're not buying any more gas from Transnistria, but they are pumping the gas or buying the electricity that the gas makes back into the country. It's kind of, there are arrangements like that. When it comes to the Transnistrian economy, a lot of it is becoming increasingly reliant on Moldova for consumer goods and whatnot, because obviously the Russians can't fly stuff in. But that's kind of been the situation for a while now. Obviously Russia can't re-support them or defend them militarily, but there's still what used to be the 14th Army sitting, or remnants of it, which is a Russian occupation force, along with the Transnistrian military as well. Now they don't have anywhere near the capacity to kind of push out and take Kishinev, but they do have probably enough enough to defend if Kishinev was to try and push against them. It's kind of that situation. Right now, the president's been in since, if memory serves, about 2016-ish. He got in, and everything kind of just runs as a nearly one-party state. But it's, everyone would like to probably get the economy a bit more going, do more, have more freedom in what they do. But at the same time, it's Russia that's offering them passports. It's Russia that supports and funds a lot of the army. In fact, it's why the army's become such an important part in Transnistria, because it's one of the only decent jobs programs in the region. Yeah, and it's obviously going to have effects on what the country can do politically. So it's kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. Will it go and join Moldova again? It's hard to see, and I think it's interesting that in the recent Moldovan elections, there's been a lot more. Transnistria hasn't been as anti-EU as other parts of the country, particularly Gagauzia in the south of Moldova. So the young people would probably like to see the country, maybe have a better arrangement with Moldova or be able to get more Moldovan passports or go down that road. But the Gagauzians are becoming increasingly angry about it. And the Transnistrians know that they would probably lose a lot of their rights if they went down that road. So it's always tough to say.
Wait, I need to check. Something about Moldova.
Mhm.
I am pretty sure they're about the same. They're about the same size as we are.
Yeah.
With slightly larger population.
Yeah, it's about right.
What's the point of us? Okay, you know what? I shouldn't be surprised about random separatism things going out all over the place over here. Just a bit strange. But that's like not even all the Russia's enclaves. I think are pretty much left on their own. So I'm thinking, surely some Russian influence has been waning in Central Asia too, because I hear reports that, for example, Donetsk still has. Well, we have an internal joke here already with my wife and editor Rob. You'll laugh, but it got worse in Donetsk with water. It always gets worse. What we have gone past the stage of water wars where people stole big trucks full of water. Right now it's winter, fuel trucks stopped coming, but now there's snow. So now we have videos of armed gangs fighting over buckets full of snow in Donetsk too on the streets. One of them is funded by Mr. Pushilin himself. We've gotten to the snow wars now, which is just bizarre. But seeing that, and that's a politically important subject for Russia, I can't seem to understand, are they still really funding Central Asia that much? Because they really don't seem to have that many resources available to them, don't they? Or is it just because of all the trade that's going on?
It will depend from country to country. The relationship that Russia has with each of these states is different. Generally, it's the younger, more metropolitan kind of Central Asians are starting to be a little less pro-Russia. I find it interesting, particularly since 2022, the amount of conversations that someone, when they first start speaking, might start the conversation in Uzbek rather than starting it in Russian, which is an interesting kind of change. The old people still tend to have very pro views of Russia, depending on which part of countries. But for the difference here being, whilst Ukraine kind of has other options open to it, if Ukraine wanted to pull away from Russia and look toward the West, it's not that difficult for them to do so. They have the EU right there. They can make trade deals. People can cross that border. For the Central Asians, Russia, is effectively the conduit to trade with the rest of the world. You need to keep good relations with Russia because most of the power and whatnot infrastructure is quite often built by the Soviets and can often be partly owned by the Russians still. The Russians are effectively the main trainers and coordinators for most of the security services. So even if you, let's say, have a government that is nominally, or even people might start to push back against Russia, the security services tend to be pro-Russia. And at the same time, if you are trying to sort of trade or get out to an exporting market and you can't use Russia, well, your only other option is China. And they all really, really don't trust the Chinese. It's kind of even if they hate Russians, they'll always pick a Russian over a Chinese person.
Why so though? Because is that because of some issue with the Communist Party or something? Because as far as I have heard, the Chinese have their own plans for decades going on. The person who is in charge of guiding me through the PhD, she's a China expert, and she's now publishing about Xi and strategic ambiguity. But China, when it signs a paper and makes a deal, they tend to observe what's written on the deal. I feel like what's the reason for this distrust towards China? I don't think that China wants to dominate them too much or something. They probably just want to trade through them to Europe anyways.
Yeah, China's relationship with the region is really odd. For one, the Central Asians, obviously, when they look at their history and look at their kind of their big famous heroes that all the statues are of in all these major cities, they're mostly old heroes like Manas or the Stuk, who end up fighting the Chinese at some point. When it comes to how Chinese operate in the country, I think kind of a good example of this is the Russians who are, let's say, working in, Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan will tend to drink with the locals. They tend to speak the same language. They get along a lot more. And particularly with the fact that most of these guys still watch Russian TV or Russian music, and you go into the bar and there's probably the Russian hits or pop music going on, on the TV. China doesn't really have that kind of soft power sitting in the country at the moment. There's no kind of, people aren't reading Chinese fan fiction or novels, or they're not watching Chinese television. And it is just this, if you hung out with Russians before, you're friends with Russians, you've met Russians a lot, you get to trust them a bit, you know them, it's not an unusual thing. But when it comes to the Chinese, not only the Chinese they look down on the Central Asians a fair bit, but they also don't interact very much. The Chinese don't spend the money, trying to do the soft power at the lower levels of society. They kind of only want to deal with the elites. Like China spent all this money to build this amazing tunnel into Tajikistan, like a great tunnel. The previous tunnel had been falling apart so badly that the rubble would fall, cars would get stuck inside, and people would die from the exhaust. It was a really, really bad situation. China took the money, put millions in to pay for a tunnel. And when I would ask locals, hey, what do you think about this tunnel? It's really great. It's cut off heaps of transit time for you. It's really good. They go, they built it big enough for tanks, which China is never going to invade these countries. But it just shows there's this massive distrust. I mean, even particularly for Tajiks and Kyrgyz, they will effectively all say that Chinese men come over to marry their women. And when you call the embassies to ask how many actual marriage certificates they've done, it's like single digits. The Kazakhs, for instance, who have quite a decent trading relationship with China and economically quite well, when it comes to the security services, they don't do very much coordination at all, to the point where Kazakhstan's really hesitant to even buy Chinese military equipment, to the point where when they were doing this kind of 8-wheel armored vehicle project with the Chinese, they had to bring the Turkish in just to make sure that it wasn't too Chinese. So there is this distrust there of how China operates, and this kind of familiarity with, I don't like the Russians as much as I used to, but I kind of know where I stand with them. They're transactional. It is what it is. That relationship will probably change as generations go on, but it's definitely still there for now.
Yeah, but this is going to cause a bunch of problems, because another thing that at least people who are seeing that Russia isn't doing as well as their propaganda says in this war, they complain that Central Asia is going to be the central point where, besides Chechnya, that's the other hotspot. Because in Stalin's era, when those, like our borders in Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, our region, we got annexed as whole countries, so our infrastructure was in place. But when Stalin redraw the maps of the Soviet republics, there was a lot of intention to make sure that they weren't that they had issues within them. This is why you got the Armenia-Azerbaijani conflict been going on before. But for example, there are like districts in the southern Russia next to Kazakhstan whose only connection to other Russian districts with railway is through Kazakhstan and other places like this. It's the whole infrastructure is built in a way to sort of make sure that you have to be connected to the whole larger thing in a way.
Kind of.
This is what these people say, so I'm just quoting here, because I sadly haven't been to Central Asia, but they say this, and I read a bunch of Russian economists stating that when people think that Russia is going to split apart, if it does, and I believe it will, it's not going to be in the current regional borders, because again, those borders are unsustainable in the sense that they will cause conflicts, and they're just infrastructure-wise, they just don't have the railway connections and all this stuff. So the problem is that there's going to be a lot of trouble trying to redraw the borders for the infrastructure connections to the rest of the world and natural resources and everything. And a lot of people are worried over there. Again, the Tajiks apparently, and I am quoting now our good old nemesis here, channel by the name of Vladimir Kvachkov. He wrote the Manifesto of the Russian World. Tajiks are going to team up with Chechens and try to take over Moscow, while Kazakhs will definitely try to invade and grab as much land as possible from us if such a collapse would happen. I really don't think that Kazakhs want any more land than they have already, but you can change me on this one, because those are two scenarios in possible futures where Central Asia gets mentioned. And well, if I look at them and they seem super crazy to me, but when I talk about this, it doesn't carry the same weight, because that's not my field of expertise. Maybe you can talk for the Tajiks and explain their master plan, how to infiltrate Moscow and somehow work with Chechens, who are totally different peoples, but okay. If there's anyone who knows this, it's you.
Yeah, I mean, there's. Let's go to the Tajiks first. So the Tajiks, don't really have that much in common apart from some of the religiosity to do with the Tajiks. There is some Shias that live in sort of Chechnya that maybe there's a bit of overlap there. But the reason they tend to get lumped in together is if you're looking for good fighters who are kind of from, let's say, Russia or the ex-Soviet regions, the Tajiks and the Chechens tended to be pretty easy candidates to look for. The Kosovars were as well. It's why ISIS-K, one of the highest per capita nationalities in serving in their forces, were Kosovars, because those guys had actual combat experience. If you're the Chechens, you'd probably fought in one of the Chechen wars, or your father had, or you kind of been through that. If you're the Tajiks, you've a good chance you fought in the Tajik Civil War, which effectively goes from about 94 to 97. So there is kind of a lot of the time they are lumped in together because they are, in conflicts and terrorism wise, they are kind of one of the sought after groups. But militarily, they have almost nothing to do trade-wise and relationship-wise with them. They might hang out in the same dodgy bars, though, with that one. When it comes to the Kazakhs, and again, when you talk about borders, I guess there's the other thing before I get into the Kazakhs. Yes, these borders are so weirdly drawn that not only do ethnicities kind of, mold over the borders all the time, but you get areas like Sulk, which is an exclave, which is effectively an area administered by Uzbekistan, completely surrounded by Kyrgyzstan, where 99.8% of the population are ethnic Tajiks. If you're following along.
I am.
Yeah.
But it's hard, though.
I don't think there'll be much team up between the Tajiks and the Chechens. I think that's, apart from your mid-level officers, it's not unsurprising to see them be one of those ethnicities. Particularly if you get a good mountain fighters. Tajiks tend to be pretty good ones. And it's why their border services and their mountain forces tend to be comparatively good for what you'd expect compared to kind of the standard motor rifle units. When it comes to the Kazakhs, absolutely, I would be shocked to see them try for more territory. Already, they have an issue that 4 of the states, so East Kazakhstan, as well as North Kazakhstan, Kostanay, and Pavlodar, have massive Russian populations already. Now, while some of the rail infrastructure does snake through Kazakhstan at points, the main rail lines don't. Like the main ones coming down from like Chelyabinsk, goes pretty much straight into Kazakhstan and then off, either down towards Astana in the south or out towards China and Horgos and whatnot. There is some of that infrastructure there, but it's kind of supplementary stuff. Where the infrastructure really does crisscross the borders are things like gas and oil infrastructure. Right now there's a massive deal going on where effectively gas comes out of Kazakhstan, gets pumped into Orenburg, which is near the border with Kazakhstan and Russia. It gets refined and then pumped back to Uzbekistan, where effectively it then gets turned into electricity, which gets exported throughout the region. So there is a lot of kind of cross-border trade going there. Would the Russians accept the Kazakhs pushing north? No, because there's a massive amount of really important Russian bases just north of the Kazakh border. Because again, when the Soviets kind of laid out everything, the Trans-Siberian Railway was, pretty much the main conduit of the military logistics, and most of that railway runs just north of the Kazakh border. Whereas if you look at the Kazakhs' military deployments, which again, Kazakhstan's mostly just kept the same, major base arrangements that it had since the end of the Cold War, there's actually really, really little troops sitting inside the north of the country, because why would the Soviets build bases up there? The Trans-Siberian and some of these major Russian units are all just up there. So if you look at, let's say, the most likely city for the hammer to fall on, which is Petropavl, the only major Kazakh units in there are some prison protection units, a small National Guard unit, and a handful of like ragtag guys. It's really not very much up there, because the Kazakhs know that they could build a bunch of bases and they'd still lose, and it would just upset the Russians and kind of inflame things. But yeah, Kazakhstan has a military that's effectively designed to be big enough that no one could invade it easily, but not big enough that it's ever going to be able to invade anyone else, particularly up near the north where Russia is relatively well supplied and has, a lot of key units like the 13th Missile Division, which is what I think it's like 50, 60 Ks just north of the Kazakh border. So I can't see Kazakhstan going down that road.
Okay, but another more serious question here, because in case Russia goes the way of the dojo, and it inevitably will, just a matter of time, but I really do hope that there's some NATO and EU global geopolitical West interaction with these states, because, once the local warlords get their nukes and they want to sell them off to someone, they're going to go through Central Asia, because not through North Korea. and probably maybe through China, but that'll be less. But big issue is that they might probably be going through over there to be sold away. So is there something that are we checking on this?
Yeah, there's a huge amount of checking on this. So it's an interesting issue. I did some research on it years ago, where effectively when the Cold War broke down, there was worry that nuclear weapons, particularly very small miniaturized nuclear weapons, would end up in the wrong hands. The US in particular put massive money and effort into effectively putting nuclear detection monitoring equipment in a huge amount of the border crossing sites. Now, Kazakhstan gave all its nukes back to Russia quite early in the piece, but one of the major concerns is the big facility that Russia uses to decommission most of its nuclear weapons, and one of the, if you're going to try and buy plutonium, that would be where you go, is in Chelyabinsk, which is really close to the Kazakh border. So what if something snuck across? The Kazakhs are checking for that, and everyone knows that the moment particularly if you want to speak to Russian mobsters, they happily sell you drugs or guns or whatever it is, but everyone knows the moment you get into nuclear, weapons, or you start asking for, even nuclear waste, that becomes whoa, I don't want that kind of heat on me at all. So I can't see the Kazakhs being willing to sell that for the reason.
You'll laugh, of course, but you would be surprised about the shit that I've seen with my dealings with these people.
Oh yeah,
and let's leave it at that.
But I'll to explain the nuclear problem. I think it's interesting because whilst mobsters don't want to sell it, people aren't really looking, for it to get out, and it is very heavily monitored. The Russians also don't take the security around these things very seriously. And I think one of the best examples of this is at that facility I was talking about that, should be monitored very, very heavily. They put a radiation sensor on the front doors. So effectively, as you walk in or walk out, if it senses you got too much radiation, it locks you in a tube and starts decontaminating you. But what happened is the workers that were eating from the river behind the facility kept triggering the radiation detector, which is already funny to me. But because it kept triggering, they didn't want to walk through it on the way home because they get stuck at work for an extra hour if they got caught. So they end up just cutting a hole in the fence between the facility and the car park, which is very funny to me. But does summarize it. I don't think the bad actors are what to worry about. I think it's just, pure poor security and nonchalance that'll probably be the more concerning point to me.
Now let's switch over from Central Asia to where you're now, Australia, because I have a Latvian Australian listener who just recently went back there to sell his house. Hello, Pete, and he was a bit shocked that he hadn't been there for 6 years, and he said it's changed, become more competitive, and everyone's a bit more worried. And that if once you Google Australian geopolitics, every research paper that you can get from Google just says conflict is possible. There might be some issues. We should do something, like very, very vague and such. It seems like from the outside, at least, it looks like you don't exactly know how to deal with anything going on there, which would be, say, hypothetically, I don't know, China invading Taiwan, maybe, or something. I haven't seen such ambiguity in news sites talking about geopolitical issues from a single country for a long while now. Everyone else usually just is more concrete. How does it feel there, and how people are viewing the world there?
I mean, it's an interesting time for Australian geopolitics at the moment, particularly when it comes to the Asia Pacific. There's a lot of things going on all at once. Now, obviously, for the Australian economy, it's dominated by China. China is our main trading partner. Without the Chinese trade, our whole country just implodes overnight. But at the same time, our main cultural partner and military partner is obviously the United States. And that obviously has an interesting dichotomy of what we do about Taiwan. Now, for years, we've been building our military, particularly after the recent doctrine updates, to do two things. One is disaster relief. Australia's really, really good at anywhere in the Pacific or anywhere in our region where there's a typhoon, a cyclone, whatever it is. Australians will rock up within 24 hours with bags of rice, sandbags, ready to go and help, because that's what we do. The other one is building deterrence against China going into Taiwan. Everything Australia is doing right now is in this position where we are desperately trying to send a message to Xi Jinping going, do not go for Taiwan. You will not take Taiwan. It's going to be too difficult. Don't do it. Because we know that once that line gets crossed, we have to cut our trade with China, and the whole economy just has a massive problem. Yet if we, were to, and this is obviously then complicated, and it made sense during the Biden administration that we're kind of, okay, we're all going to work together and trying to China going into Taiwan. But now with Trump, it's a lot more difficult for Australians because the Australian population has a massive dislike of Trump, apart from, let's say, I think his last polling here was like 20% support, maybe a bit below that, with a massive dislike of the guy. So, it's whilst we were willing to kind of jump into alliances like AUKUS, and while we were willing to do these massive defense deals with the United States under the Biden administration, when again we had these shared kind of ideas of how we should approach the Asia Pacific, now it's getting a bit more complicated because I don't think people trust the Trump administration nearly as much as the previous one, and B, are willing to kind of close you up to the US as much as they used to. So we're stuck between our economic partner, who's our lifeline, and our military partner, who we would also need to have on side in order to stop the disastrous regional war that we're all trying to avoid.
Well, then the final question is, because I found this article specifically interesting. It was written by Shay Gal, defenseconnect.com.au, about the whole situation, because I wanted to ask you about this. Here's an interesting quote there about the diasporas of other nations inside of Australia, because apparently it's about more than a quarter of Australians were born overseas. And then the direct quote here happens, which please explain this to me and give me some context. Quote, "Here lies the taboo Canberra avoids. Officials acknowledge interference in diaspora communities, yet resist attribution. This restraint is strategic. It signals tolerance for coercion so long as it avoids spectacle. Bondi crossed that line. Diaspora coercion is designed not to. Parliamentary inquiries confirm the reality. Diaspora communities in Australia face surveillance, intimidation, and interference by foreign state actors. The unresolved question is why the response remains selective, forceful when the offender is expendable, cautious when it's economically or politically inconvenient." This is literally from January the 6th, the most recent one about security issues. I never really expected to see something which would remind me of the hybrid warfare we experience here to be said about Australia at all. Is that a thing? Do people really feel intimidated or something? How physical is this, and is it just overblown? Because again, I don't know what the defenseconnect.com.au site is. So
yeah, it's I think it's a little overblown. I'm going to Google a stat for 2 seconds. I just want to compare something. Yeah, so right now, for instance, the United States, from what I can see here in front of me, is about 14% of the United States population is born overseas. In Australia, that's actually around 31% of the population is born overseas. My wife wasn't born here. My parents weren't born here, and neither were my wife's parents. So Australia is a much more multicultural country than Canada or the United States. I think the difference here, though, is that whilst, yes, some of the first generation people might have some struggles integrating into the community, and there are some tensions in between certain sects, by the time you hit your kids and they go through school here, because our schools are very big on pushing like team sports and lots of activities that these people do together, a lot of that kind of melts down a bit. No one's more friendly but also more racist than a multi-ethnic group of Australians at a bar at some point. It's a weird dynamic that, again, everyone is born from somewhere else, but we all kind of get along and everyone is Australians at the end of the day. Could there be a diaspora used to kind of go against Australian interests? That's possible. There have been some sloppier operations by a few nation state actors inside the country, but we also have pretty robust security services over here, and I'm sure they're keeping eyes on most things. Obviously there was the Bondi attacks, and that the whole bunch of reasons that one got through. But yeah, generally, I don't see it as a kind of no one's concerned the Chinese community are going to grab rifles and come up and help us, or come occupy a city waiting for the rest of the Chinese military to rock up, because we're all eating the same Chinese food and we're all getting along fairly well. Again, it's a weird country and it's hard to explain to anyone unless you are Australian, that everyone hates everyone equally but also loves everyone equally. And I think everyone's your best friend, and as long as you make fun of the Kiwis.
I mean, wise choice. Everyone knows that while you prepare about the Taiwan, the Kiwis are about to invade you. Obviously.
Exactly. While our military's in the Taiwan Strait, that's when the New Zealanders sneak up from behind and take us. I knew it. That's the plan.
Well, thank you for this update of all the places that I knew that you know a lot about, and I haven't had the time to check on. You feel burnt out sometimes. Let's have a breather episode where we talk about some utter nonsense, which is unrelated to all this mess, because that stuff's really necessary. Just remember that standard academia people and everyone else, and that's to your listeners and everyone who makes these shows, yeah, we're people too, and sometimes it does get insanely difficult, but I suppose that you kind of have to do that. You kind of have to do this stuff. Like I've also seen people just especially these days, I'm not sure if you've heard this, but because of how I've chosen my profession, I heard last time why don't you get a real job about 2024, and that is the moment where I understood that I also have to take care of myself. So it's a real thing, and I understand how this is going on. But truly, while you were gone, I do have to say, I have to give credit to the ambassador of your show to my Discord channel. Please, everyone, join my Discord or join Mike's Discord. But the diplomacy has been kept very well. Yes, I have to give him props, give him a medal or something. It's going to be great.
He's the best ambassador our security services could deploy. The Red Line Security Services.
Also, next time you are around here in our parts, you'll be the person whom I'll call, because I know will want to go there. Hey, I'll call you about 2 weeks before stuff goes down, but do you want to be with the guys who are going to overthrow Lukashenko in Belarus?
Sure, would love it. I've my last trip to Belarus, they put corn on my pizza, and everyone on the Irish bar wore kilts, so I think I've never forgiven them from that day.
Well, I am officially not allowed in there anymore, which is silly. But seriously, you'll probably need this, because otherwise, you feel too happy with your warmth and kindness and too much nice. You need more winter.
Too much nice. I've been described many ways, but too much nice is usually not.
I had to make this more depressing. Otherwise, I can't say happiness is mandatory at the end.
Look, I think I depressed everyone enough. We could do a happiness is mandatory. I think I double quoted our depression for the day.
However, comrade, please, if you have anything interesting, let me know. Nice to have you back. And to you, dear listeners, I'm finally starting to not feel horribly cold. We're going to repeat this again because I have my other list of questions for Mike, but that'll wait for a while because I have to allow him to make his own episodes too. До свидания, товарищи. Happiness is mandatory. And Mike, what is your sign-off now? You have to have one.
Oh, I guess just, good to be with you, and, don't let the vodka go to waste.
Oh, man. I'll give you all about Shvakovka. Okay. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you for listening to the Eastern Border Show. If you have any questions or comments, go to our website, theeasternborder.lv, and leave a comment there. Or email us at theeasternborder@gmail.com. We'll be sure to answer. You can also follow us on social media and contact us there. If you enjoyed this episode, then leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and tell your friends about us. It really helps us grow the show. And remember, happiness is mandatory.